By the third night of the Whitehorn blizzard, the Redwash Basin had ceased to exist. Wind tore across the flats at better than 60 miles an hour, and the cold had dropped to 30 below. Snow buried the fence posts and erased every line between earth and sky. At the Coldwater crossing, a section of the willow windbreak had torn free. Harlan Vexley tied a rope around his waist and put the other end into Mara Bellwether's hands. If the wall gave way, the wind would slam straight into the offset barn door and seal it shut with drift. Inside, Eli counted marker posts through the whiteout. Nell cried behind the canvas curtain. A milk cow strained in early labor. Noah Pike, the hand who had once mocked Harlan's work, lay exhausted beside the stove. The rope jerked once, then it went still. 6 weeks earlier, Harlan Vexley had stumbled onto this land with a single request: a little milk for his child. How had it come to this? That the survival of an entire ranch now rested on whether one man could keep his footing in the snow. Late in September of 1887, Harlan Vexley reached Coldwater Reach with nothing but an old handcart and 2 children. He was only 39, though the road had aged him past it. His coat was patched with 2 mismatched pieces of cloth. One hand pulled the cart, the other carried 10-month-old Nell against his shoulder. 7-year-old Eli walked beside the wheel and never once asked how much farther it was. Harlan had spent years mending barns, freight wagons, hand pumps, and storage sheds along the Union Pacific supply line, ever since his wife Lydia died of childbed fever. He could no longer travel with a repair crew and raise 2 children alone. 3 ranches had already turned him away. One offered him work, but not a roof for his children. Another gave them a single night's bed before sending them back onto the road. A third suggested Nell would be better off raised by another family. Harlan kept walking. On their last day before reaching the ranch, only thin grain porridge would settle Nell. Eli quietly slipped half his cornbread into his coat. Even after his father promised there would be food again tomorrow, Harlan saw what the boy had done and understood the truth of it. His son no longer believed in tomorrow. Then Coldwater Reach rose beyond a wind-scoured ridge. The barn roof sagged, its main doors opened straight into the northwest wind. An old willow row stood too close to the building, half dead already. Smoke streamed sideways from the chimney. But inside the corral, the milk cows were still standing. Mara Bellwether, the widowed owner of Coldwater Reach, stood at the stock trough breaking a skin of early ice with the back of a hammer. It was far too soon in the season for water to freeze. She studied the stranger and his 2 children before she asked a single question. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, a feed ledger tucked beneath her belt, one glove worn smooth by years of holding reins. Nothing about her looked like a woman waiting to be rescued. "What do you know how to do?" she asked. Harlan answered without offering his story. "Barn frames, hand pumps, troughs, wagon wheels, roofs, doors, hay storage. What do you need?" His eyes settled on Nell, who chewed the corner of her blanket in silence because hunger had outlasted tears. "Give my children milk. Let us sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix whatever winter's about to break." Mara glanced toward her barn. "What makes you think anything's broken?" Harlan raised a hand toward the buildings. "Your doors face straight into the northwest wind. Your hay's pulling damp from the ground. That waterline will freeze before the first real front." Silence settled between them. Confidence was cheap on the frontier. Proof was not. Mara looked at Eli, then at Nell, still resting against her father's shoulder. Without answering a word of his claim, she stepped forward and lifted the little girl gently from his trembling arms. "The milk comes first," she said quietly. "Your claims can wait until morning." Mara led them into the kitchen without another question. She warmed fresh cow's milk with a little water, tested it against her wrist, and nodded toward Harlan. Slowly, she said, "Her stomach's been empty too long." A bowl of beef stew, cornbread, and dried apples appeared in front of Eli. Another waited for Harlan, even after he quietly insisted he wasn't hungry. Eli ate without a word. Before he finished, he pocketed the last of his bread. Mara noticed. She said nothing, only laid another piece beside his bowl as if it had always belonged there. Across the table, Harlan tried to feed Nell, but his hands shook with exhaustion. Mara reached over and steadied the cup from underneath without taking the child from his arms. Between bites, they traded only the facts that mattered. Lydia had died 6 months earlier of childbed fever. Calder Bellwether, Mara's late husband and the ranch's original builder, had been killed 3 winters back when a logging wagon slid off an icy mountain grade. Mara had never had children of her own. Coldwater Reach was still carrying debt from a herd that had lost 9 head the previous winter. That evening, Mara carried down an old cradle from the loft above the foreman's room. One Calder had started years earlier and never finished. A single rail was still rough, never sanded smooth. Harlan noticed she had kept it all this time instead of burning it for firewood. Nell slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle that night. Eli fell asleep with his hands still closed tight around the hoarded bread in his pocket. Before sunrise, Harlan was already walking the length of the ranch. He didn't lift a hammer or move a single board. He only watched. A scrap of wool tied beside the barn door showed him how the wind curled through the gap. He dug beneath the haystack with a shovel and found damp earth under the bottom layer. He poured water into the trough and timed how slowly it drained. Inside the house, a thin skin of frost clung to the shrinking chink between the logs. Outside, hardened ridges of old snow still sat against the fence where last winter had piled them. Mara followed without announcing herself. When Harlan finally spoke, he pointed instead of arguing. The barn isn't losing heat because the walls are thin, it's losing heat because the wind walks straight through the doors. He knelt by the hay. This stack's spoiling from the bottom. He nodded toward the pump. That line sits too shallow. It has nowhere to drain. His hand rested against the house wall. The chinkings pulled away from the logs. Last, he looked to the dying willow row. Those trees stand too close. Last winter, the drift piled exactly where you needed a clear door. Mara folded her arms. Calder planted those willows. He wasn't wrong to, Harlan said. She looked at him surprised. They work against spring wind. Winter storms come from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Some of the tension left her face. Harlan looked once more across the ranch. 6 weeks, he said. Water first, then hay, then the windbreak, the offset entrance, fresh chinking, marker posts, all before the first real storm. Mara studied him a long moment before pointing toward the tool shed. You get 1 week. Then I'll decide whether you see problems or invent them. Harlan started with the jobs least likely to start a fight. The hay came first. Together with Mara and Eli, he lifted away the bottom layers of the stack. A sour smell rose where moisture had pooled against the ground. He built a raised crib 8 inches high from old pine rails behind the shed, and instead of piling the hay into one solid mound again, he divided it into sections with narrow air channels between them. Eli's job was simple. 8 inches, Harlan told him, and the boy measured every gap with a stick and counted the spaces aloud, the most words he'd spoken since they arrived. Next came the water line. Harlan opened a test trench and found the pipe buried barely 2 feet down. It needs to sit near 5, he said, with enough fall to empty itself after every use. Mara studied the trench. We don't have time to dig the whole line. Then we won't, Harlan answered. We protect the stretch between the well and the milking cows first. There was no argument, only a shorter plan. That afternoon, Ruth Fenley, an elderly widow from a neighboring spread who quietly watched over the families of the basin, stopped by with fresh goat's milk and quiet news. Silas Glay had been asking about Mara's new man. Nobody answered. As Ruth set 2 loaves of bread on the table, she noticed the bread Eli had tucked into his pocket. She glanced at Mara. Should I leave another loaf? Mara shook her head. Leave both. That night, Harlan handed Mara a short list. Everything that could be reused was marked first. Everything that truly needed buying came last. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of Harlan's new windbreak across open ground. It would stand 34 feet northwest of the barn, not in front of it, not against it, but far enough to weaken the wind before it reached the buildings. The frame would form an L, rising over 7 feet at its tallest point. Lodgepole pine would carry the weight, willow branches woven between the posts, never tight enough to stop every gust outright, with sod and brush anchoring the base. Harlan and Eli were driving another post when a horse stopped at the fence. Silas Glay, the largest ranch owner in Red Wash Basin and Mara's longtime rival, dismounted without a greeting. Years earlier, after Calder's death, he'd offered to buy Coldwater Reach at a price Mara refused, and he'd spoken of the ranch's failure as inevitable ever since. He looked over the growing frame and smiled. "So this is Vexley's willow wall." His boot nudged a post. "All it'll do is catch snow and bury your barn." Harlan rested both hands on the post driver. "If I'd built it too close, you'd be right. Distance is the whole point." Silas turned to Mara instead. "Since when does a drifter become your engineer?" Mara never looked up from the survey stakes. "He's not a drifter," she said evenly. "He's my foreman, until the work proves otherwise." The words surprised everyone, Harlan included. Silas laughed quietly. "You'll still need my freight road once winter shuts the passes." "If you've got business," Mara said, "put it in writing." Silas climbed back into the saddle, glanced once more at the unfinished wall and said, "Winter will decide which of us is wasting his time," before riding off without another word. Eli watched until the horse disappeared over the rise. "What if he's right?" Harlan reached for the next willow pole. "Then we change it before the snow does." The first hard squall arrived sooner than expected. Harlan tied cloth strips to the willow posts before the wind reached the ranch, wanting to see how the air actually moved instead of guessing. The answer came within minutes. The center of the windbreak was woven too tight. The wind climbed over it, dropped behind it, and slammed into the ground short of the barn. Thin snow and dry grass began drifting toward the entrance. A woven panel tore loose. An old milk cow balked at the temporary gap and nearly wrenched a hinge off the gate. Across the basin, two of Silas Glay's hands stopped their wagon just long enough to watch. Harlan didn't defend the mistake. He cut away nearly a fifth of the willow from the center. Mara studied the fluttering cloth for a moment. "Weave the next pieces on a diagonal. Let the wind spread out instead of fighting one flat wall." They worked until sunset. When the next gust came, it passed through the willow, lost its force, and reached the barn as little more than a breath. Harlan nodded toward the cloth. "A windbreak that stops everything just becomes another cliff. The wind only needs to lose its strength, not disappear." The offset entrance revealed its own flaw. The turn was too sharp, and the old cow refused the dark corner. Mara measured the gap with her eyes. "We widen it." They moved the gate, opened the angle, and hung a lantern where the shadow had spooked the cattle. As darkness settled over the ranch, Mara handed Harlan the willow cutters. "Your wall," she said, glancing at the cloth still dancing in the wind. "My wind." Then she allowed herself a small smile. "We fixed both." A week later, Edwin March, the county's livestock inspector, rode in after hearing that Mara was rebuilding her barn before winter. He didn't laugh. He asked hard questions instead. A barn sealed too tight could trap moisture. Deep bedding could build up ammonia. A hay crib could heat itself from the inside if the air didn't move. A homemade water line could pull dirt back into the trough. That canvas curtain was only safe as long as it stayed well clear of the stovepipe. Harlan listened without interrupting. Together they checked the ridge vent, tested the bedding by hand, measured the warmth inside the haystack, checked the distance from curtain to stovepipe, and examined the drain valve on the water line. Before he left, March made one request: keep records for 3 weeks. Morning and evening temperatures, firewood burned, hay fed, bedding moisture. Every time the trough had to be broken free of ice. Mara hung a ledger by the kitchen door. March pointed to where the pipe crossed through the wall. "That crossing's bleeding heat. It could become a cold bridge." "I'll box it in dry wool and wood," Harlan said. March nodded once. "I don't believe your system will work." Harlan took no offense. "You shouldn't. Not yet. Not until it does." Mara handed Eli a pencil. "Write today's numbers," she said. The boy carefully marked the first line of the ledger. From that morning forward, facts would speak before opinions ever got the chance. But before the numbers could prove anything, the cold spoke first, in a practical test of its own. The first batch of chinking failed. Harlan had mixed in too much clay. After 2 cold nights, the fresh seams pulled away from the logs, fine cracks opening along the wall. A wool strip held against it still fluttered in the draught. Without complaint, Harlan reached for his scraper. "We start over," Mara stopped him. "My father used to seal sheep sheds," she said. "Calder learned it from him. Less clay, more animal hair, more rice straw. Scratch the first coat before you finish the second." They mixed a new batch, and this one gripped the logs instead of pulling free. Later, searching the loft, Harlan found an old canvas roll, its leather stitching still intact. "Lydia made this," he said quietly. "We used it as a draft curtain in a freight camp." He began measuring where to cut it. "You don't have to," Mara said, but together they hung the whole thing between the sleeping room and the main room without removing a single stitch. As they worked, Harlan spoke of Lydia for the first time. "She never feared the cold," he said, "but she always checked a child's wrist before she checked the fire. She could sew a tighter leather seam than most men could build with wood." Mara smiled faintly. "Calder used to set 2 tin cups by the stove every morning." The next morning, 2 cups stood there again. Neither of them said why. That evening the room held its warmth far longer than before. Harlan rested his hand on Lydia's old stitching for a moment, then quietly let it go. The canvas stayed exactly where it belonged. The rhythm of the ranch slowly settled into something steady. While Harlan worked outdoors, Mara looked after Nell without ceremony, warming milk, changing blankets, walking slow circles by the stove when the baby grew restless. Before long, she could tell a cry for warmth from a cry for food. At first, she held the child too stiffly. Then something changed. Nell stopped crying the moment she heard Mara's boots on the floor. Small fingers reached for the collar of her coat. More than once, she fell asleep on Mara's shoulder, while Mara kept writing in the ledger with a pencil in her free hand. One evening, Harlan stepped inside and found them standing exactly like that. He reached for Nell. Mara gave the smallest shake of her head. She just fell asleep. Harlan only set his dry gloves beside the stove for Mara to warm her hands later, and went back out to check the trough. Another afternoon, Eli helped shell dry beans into a wooden bowl. After a long silence, he looked up. "Why don't you have any children?" Mara smiled without looking up from her hands. "Some rooms get built and never filled." Eli glanced toward the unfinished cradle where Nell slept. "That one's filled now." Mara said nothing to that. The next morning, Harlan noticed something he'd been hoping for weeks to see. The usual leftover cornbread sat untouched on the table. For the first time since Lydia died, Eli had gone to sleep believing it would still be there tomorrow. The first real cold snap arrived sooner than anyone expected. By sunrise, the temperature had fallen to 12 above zero, the first honest test of everything they'd built. The old barn had once struggled to hold 19 degrees, with drafts crossing the floor all day. Now, behind the windbreak and the offset entrance, the milk barn held between 30 and 33 whenever the inner doors stayed shut. The house burned 5 armloads of firewood instead of 7. The bedding stayed dry. The hay under the raised crib smelled clean instead of sour. Then the water stopped. The buried line stayed open, but the metal coupling at the trough had frozen solid. Edwin March had been right. The stretch where the pipe met open air had become a cold bridge. Harlan broke the ice free with an axe. "I missed it," he said, no excuse in his voice. Together, he and Mara lowered the drain valve, boxed the coupling in wood, packed it with dry wool waste, wrapped it in tarred cloth, and left just enough airspace to keep moisture from collecting. They worked past midnight. Mara brought out 2 tin cups of hot chicory coffee. Harlan took his without lifting his eyes. "I said I'd fix this ranch." "You did." The water still froze. Mara blew across the steam before she drank. "You promised to fix it," she said quietly. "You never promised to guess right the first time." The words stayed with him longer than the coffee did. The next morning they filled the trough again, the water flowed, and when the cattle finished drinking, the line emptied itself exactly as planned. For the first time, Harlan understood something that had nothing to do with pipes. Mara wasn't measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. For 3 weeks the ledger filled, one careful line at a time. Every morning Eli recorded the temperature. Mara added the firewood, the hay fed, the milk gathered, the moisture in the bedding, every time the trough needed breaking. Slowly, the numbers built their own argument. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood on cold days, hay use down almost 20%, milk output steady since the line was repaired. The trough hadn't frozen once. Edwin March returned and read every page before closing the book. "I wouldn't call it proven," he said, "but it's doing exactly what it should." That same afternoon, Silas Glay rode in. "When the snow comes," he said, "my freight road closes unless you sign your spring water rights over to my herd." "No," Mara answered. Silas shrugged. "A few cold nights aren't winter." Harlan said nothing until Silas had ridden off. Then he asked only one question. "How many days of hay if his road stays shut?" 19 by the old numbers, Mara said. "Longer if the ledger's right." Harlan studied the grey sky. "We prepare for 26. Without another word, Mara opened the book, wrote 26 beneath the last entry, and drew a single line under it. From that moment, the ranch prepared for the winter they hoped would never come. The sky began to change 3 days before the storm reached them. At noon, the mare Juniper turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. The air grew heavy, low clouds stretching across the basin in long grey bands. Just before sunset, the wind died without warning, and the birds vanished. Harlan and Mara stopped talking about improvements. Now they prepared for survival. Marker posts went into the ground every 18 feet. The cistern was filled to the top. Hay moved closer to the barn without closing off the air channels. Every rope on the windbreak was checked again. The milk cows and calves moved into the sheltered section. Extra lanterns hung in the offset entrance. A guide rope ran from the house to the barn. A repair bag waited by the door. Eli watched the last marker post vanish into the frozen ground. "Why do we need both, the rope and the posts?" Harlan pulled another knot tight. "A rope keeps a man from drifting. Posts tell him whether he's still going somewhere." Searching the shed, Mara found an old stake carved with Calder's mark and carried it to the position nearest the house. Harlan reinforced the repair bag with a leather strap Lydia had sewn years before. Nothing useful was left behind. Near dusk, Ruth Fenley stopped on her way south to stay with relatives until the storm passed. She left fresh goat's milk on the table. Her eyes lingered a moment on the 2 tin cups by the stove, but she said nothing. At dark, a written warning arrived from Edwin March. An Arctic front was pushing south. Winds could exceed 60 miles an hour. Once the snow began, no one should leave shelter. Everything that could be prepared had been. Now the ranch would wait on the only judge that mattered. The Whitehorn blizzard broke before dawn. The first blast came out of the northwest, exactly as Harlan had said it would. The windbreak bent, but held. Snow gathered exactly where it was meant to, well clear of the barn doors. The offset entrance broke the wind's force before it reached the cattle. The cistern stayed open beneath its cover. The trough filled, then drained itself before the pipe could freeze. Behind Lydia's canvas curtain, the children's room held its warmth. Harlan and Mara crossed between house and barn one at a time, clipped to the guide rope. By midday, one marker post had vanished beneath the drift. The next still showed its fluttering strip of cloth. Late that afternoon, a dull pounding sounded beyond the windbreak. Harlan followed the line of posts into the white dark and found Noah Pike half buried beside the next marker, his horse gone, his cheeks white with frostbite. He'd lost Silas Glay's crew hours earlier. "I saw the cloth," Noah whispered. "That's why I kept walking." Harlan carried him inside without another word. When Noah woke by the stove, he spoke between slow breaths. "Silas's north barn, winds blowing straight through it. Cattle are packed in one corner, still trying to reach water." No one answered. Noah looked up at the canvas hanging between the rooms. Only days before, he'd laughed at Vexley's willow wall. Now that same system had carried him home. The storm tightened its grip overnight, the temperature falling further before sunrise. Maple, the oldest milk cow, went into labor weeks too soon. Mara knew instantly something was wrong. The calf lay turned. Dr. Amos Keene, the county veterinarian, couldn't reach the ranch. The roads were buried. There would be no help beyond the people already inside the barn. While Harlan checked the water line and the windbreak, Mara washed her hands in warm water, tied Maple's tail aside, found the calf's forelegs, and worked slowly with boiled carving straps exactly as Amos had once shown her. Eli held the lantern, his hands shaking. "Watch her eyes," Mara said softly. He did. Harlan returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid onto the straw. It didn't breathe. Mara cleared its mouth. Harlan rubbed its ribs with clean straw. Without being asked, Eli pressed a dry towel into Mara's hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the calf drew its first breath, and everyone stopped moving. From the house, Nell began to cry. Still weak from the day before, Noah pulled the unfinished cradle closer to the stove and quietly warmed another bottle of milk. No one stood outside the work anymore. The dry bedding kept the newborn off the frozen floor. The offset entrance kept the wind from the carving stall. Running water made clean hands possible. The lantern in the widened passage kept the cattle calm. Eli finally let out the breath he'd been holding since the calf hit the straw. The third day brought the hardest wind yet. Just past noon, one of the lashings on the north section of the windbreak snapped. The woven panel shook violently. If it failed, wind would pour straight through the offset passage, snow would bury the entrance, and within hours the cattle could be sealed inside. Harlan reached for the rope. Mara caught the other end without a word. Outside, the storm erased everything past the next marker. Harlan crawled from stake to stake. One post had already snapped, and the loose lattice slammed into him, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open, tools scattering across the drift. Only Lydia's old leather strap kept the bag from blowing away entirely. Inside the barn, Maple bellowed. Nell cried from the house. Mara gripped the rope with both hands, then felt 3 sharp tugs, their signal. Give line. She fed more rope into the storm. Harlan reached the broken section and braced it with a spare pole laid across the frame. Not rebuilt, only held. It didn't need to last forever, only until morning. The rope finally went still. Mara pulled, and a figure crawled out of the white dark on one arm and one knee. Harlan pushed himself upright. "It'll hold till morning." Mara looked past him at the storm still raging across the basin. "Morning's enough." By the 4th morning, the wind had finally begun to weaken. No one celebrated. They started counting instead. Every animal that mattered was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding stayed dry. Water still flowed through the trough. The hay crib showed no heat, no spoilage. The barn doors opened without a fight against snow. Firewood was still stacked by the stove. Noah stood on his own 2 feet again. Harlan walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief. One brace had run too light. 2 marker posts needed to sit deeper. The outer cloth strips needed stronger stitching. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof. Mara watched him write. "You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived." Harlan closed the notebook. "The living can wait an hour." He looked out over the battered windbreak. A weakness shouldn't be allowed to hide behind success. Later, the clouds broke just enough to show a strip of grey sky. Steam drifted off the cattle as they breathed into the cold. "The children have their milk," Mara said quietly. Harlan studied the broken section of willow. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them spoke of spring. Neither of them spoke of leaving. That evening, Mara set Harlan's dry gloves beside the 2 tin cups by the stove, as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. When the roads finally opened, people came to Coldwater Reach for answers instead of rumor. Edwin March arrived first, then Dr. Amos Keene, then neighboring ranchers who'd spent 4 days digging their own cattle from the drifts. March inspected everything without hurrying: the barn's temperature, the bedding by hand, the water system, the surviving herd, the remaining hay, and every page of the ledger, from the first week to the last entry written during the storm itself. At last he closed the book. The barn stayed drier, the herd burned less feed than it should have. Stable water made the difference. That windbreak stood where the snow wanted to settle, not where the doors needed to open. And every flaw you found early got fixed before the blizzard arrived. Noah spoke next. "I'd be dead if those marker posts weren't standing." Silas Glay came last. His own ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had torn away. He offered no apology, only looked toward the willow wall. How far did you set it from the barn? 34 feet through the middle, Harlan said, then adjusted for the ground. And you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely. Silas nodded once. Show me. Harlan walked beside him across the snow without another word. Later, once everyone had gone, Mara led Harlan into the ranch office and set a folded agreement on the desk. It granted him a share of the ranch's profit, authority over the water systems, the structural work, and winter preparation. One line stood apart from the rest. Eli and Nell would always have a home at Coldwater Reach, whatever came to pass between the two adults. Harlan looked up. Why give me part of something that's always been yours? Mara met his eyes without hesitation. I'm not giving you what was mine. She turned the paper toward him. I'm naming what you already carried. That evening, after the agreement was signed, they sat together by the stove while the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the storm. The fire burned low. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. At last, Harlan looked into his cup. I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life. Mara wrapped both hands around her coffee. You don't owe me one, but there's one here, if you mean to share it. Harlan smiled for the first time in months. I'll stay till the snow's gone. Mara glanced toward the window, where ice still clung to the fence. Stay till the grass comes back. He raised his eyes. Longer than that. They didn't marry as soon as the roads reopened. The work still came first. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt the damaged windbreak, and under Harlan's guidance, neighboring ranches, even Silas Glaze, adopted the Coldwater winter plan. It wasn't until early May that Harlan and Mara held a quiet wedding, witnessed by Dr. Amos and Inspector March. The celebration lasted only as long as it took to sign the papers, since Maple was calving again that same afternoon. Silas never came, but a neat bundle of straight willow stakes left leaning against the fence served as a silent blessing all the same. A few days later, Eli looked up from the ledger. Do I have to call you something else now? You never have to call me anything you don't mean, Mara said, smiling. Eli nodded. For her, that was enough. But weeks later, after tripping near the marker posts, he blurted out, Ma! And she rushed to brush the dirt from his hands, pretending not to have heard the word he'd almost finished. Spring returned slowly. Beside the barn post where Eli had just carved a new snow line, little Nell took careful, unsteady steps toward Mara. Ma! The small voice carried across the yard. Mara didn't rush forward. She simply knelt and waited, patient, while the girl finished the last few steps on her own. Harlan let his eyes travel over the repaired windbreak, the open barn doors, the grazing cattle. It still needs fixing. That's a good thing, Mara said, handing him the second tin cup. You said you'd stay as long as there was work. Coldwater Reach didn't survive because the winter showed mercy. It showed none. It survived because every weakness was found and mended before the storm could use it. Harlan and Mara never rescued each other. They simply stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. And out here on the frontier, that lesson would outlast any winter.